The gavel struck like thunder, echoing across the courtroom, and in that instant, everyone knew something was off. Judge Beryl Howell leaned forward, her voice dripping with authority, her eyes fixed on one person, Jasmine Crockett. The words came sharp, deliberate, and meant to wound. This court will consider sanctions. The air shifted. Gasps rose from the gallery. Reporters scribbled furiously, sensing the headline of the year. It wasn't just about a sanction. It was about silencing a woman who had come too far, fought too hard, and refused to bow to power. Crockett sat still, her face calm but her eyes burning, as though she had already seen this play before. Howell thought this was her moment of dominance, her chance to remind everyone who held the gavel. But what Howell didn't realize was that she had just lit a fire she could never control. The judge's words weren't just a threat against Crockett. They were a threat against every voice that dares to speak truth to power. And in that courtroom, packed with journalists, activists, and silent observers, the tension curled through the air like smoke. Some leaned forward in disbelief. Others froze, waiting for the blow to land. Howell smirked, confident in her authority, confident this young Congresswoman would be rattled, shamed, and silenced. But Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. Instead, she let the silence linger. She let the weight of Howell's arrogance hang heavy in the air. That silence was more powerful than any objection, more piercing than any legal citation. The room belonged to Crockett now, though no one realized it yet. For Howell, this was supposed to be the beginning of the end. For Crockett, it was the opening act of something much bigger. Every second of that silence grew into a statement. I will not be intimidated. And deep down, people watching, both in the room and those who would later see the headlines, felt something stirring. It wasn't just about one sanction, one ruling, or one judge. It was about dignity versus arrogance, truth versus power, justice versus manipulation. And just when it seemed the gavel had crushed the moment, Crockett leaned forward ever so slightly, her lips parting as though to speak. The room froze. Cameras clicked. Hearts pounded. What came next would not just defy Howell's expectation. It would stun the entire nation. For anyone else, a sanction might have been a simple disciplinary measure, a technical slap on the wrist. But for Jasmine Crockett, the stakes were far greater. This wasn't about paperwork, procedure, or legal decorum. It was about credibility, about silencing a voice that had become too loud, too fearless, too unshakably real. A sanction would not just stain her record. It would be paraded as proof by her opponents. See? She's reckless. She's unfit. She doesn't belong here. Judge Howell knew this. That was the power behind her threat. The sanction wasn't a weapon. It was a shadow of what it implied. The ripple effect it would unleash in headlines, in campaign ads, in whispered conversations about whether Crockett had finally been put in her place. And that's exactly why Howell wielded it so brazenly. But Crockett was no stranger to being underestimated. She had built her career on the rubble of every dismissal, every insult, every attempt to paint her as too loud or too bold. To her, this moment was nothing new. Yet the difference now was the stage. This wasn't just a small committee room or a local hearing. This was a high-profile courtroom where every word, every gesture, every breath carried the weight of national consequence. The journalists in the back row knew it too. You could see it in the way their pens scratched faster, in the way cameras lingered on Crockett's face, waiting to capture either her collapse or her defiance. Social media would soon light up, hashtags already forming in the mind of activists watching live feeds. If Howell succeeded in branding Crockett as reckless, it would be ammunition for every opponent she had ever faced. If Crockett turned around, it would be a story of resistance that could inspire millions. And then came the cruel irony. Howell spoke of upholding integrity while using her bench like a bully pulpit. Every phrase was meant not to preserve justice, but to undermine dignity. Every word was a reminder that those in power could bend the rules to their will. The air tightened as Howell doubled down, insisting that sanctions were necessary to protect the process. But for those watching closely, it was clear this was about punishment, not process. Crockett let her calmness do the talking. She didn't rush to protest, didn't stumble into defensive explanations. Instead, She measured every glance, every pause, making the judge's theatrics look desperate by comparison. It was a kind of composure that says, I know the truth. I don't need to shout to make it heard. The stakes had been set. If Howell succeeded, Crockett would wear the label of sanctioned troublemaker, her words forever questioned. If Crockett rose above, she wouldn't just protect her own credibility. She would expose Howell's misuse of authority for the world to see. The room could feel it. Reporters, spectators. Even clerks shifted uneasily in their seats. This wasn't going to be another dry legal proceeding. This was going to be a showdown. And as Howell leaned back with the smug certainty of someone convinced she had already won, Crockett's eyes flickered with something else entirely. The spark of someone preparing to turn the tables. Because what was coming next wasn't a retreat. It was a counterstrike. To understand why this moment carried such weight, you had to know who Judge Beryl Howell was, or at least who she believed herself to be. For years, Howell had cultivated the image of a no-nonsense arbiter, the kind of judge who demanded respect the moment she entered the room. Colleagues whispered about her sharp tongue, her impatience with those who dared challenge her authority. To some, she was a protector of the system. To others, she was the system's sharpest weapon. But beneath the robe, a pattern had emerged, one critics could not ignore. Time and again, Howell seemed less interested in balance and more intent on control. Her rulings were peppered with language that carried not just legal weight, but personal disdain. Detractors describe her as someone who blurred the line between judgment and vendetta, wielding the gavel not only to interpret the law, but to remind everyone that she was the law. And in this sanctioned threat against Jasmine Crockett, the pattern was unmistakable. Howell wasn't simply enforcing rules. She was flexing power, asserting dominance, trying to humiliate a rising voice that refused to stay in line. The very idea of Crockett, a bold, unapologetic congresswoman, unafraid to speak truth in a space where truth was often inconvenient, was a kind of challenge Howell had always crushed. Or so she thought. Yet history had a way of catching up. While Howell's defenders painted her as principled, more and more critics were pointing out the contradictions. She spoke of fairness while practicing favoritism. She preached decorum while wielding insults. She demanded respect while showing very little herself. To those who watched closely, the mask of impartiality was cracking. That crack widened the moment she targeted Crockett. Because this wasn't just another lawyer or another litigant. This was someone whose strength came not from privilege or position, but from resilience. Crockett represented everything Howell had worked to keep in check. Defiance, dignity, and the audacity to stand unshaken in the face of authority. And so, in this courtroom, Howell wasn't just a judge. She was a symbol of arrogance dressed in robes. She was a villain who believed her gavel was invincible. But what she didn't realize was that Crockett wasn't playing by her script. Long before Jasmine Crockett found herself seated in that courtroom, staring down the weight of Judge Howell's sanctioned threat, she had walked a path carved by resilience. Her story was never one of privilege or shortcuts. It was a story of grit, the kind forged in late nights, uphill battles, and a determination to never let anyone else write her destiny. Born into a community where opportunity often felt like a distant promise, Crockett understood struggle from the start. She watched friends silenced by circumstance, neighbors ignored by those in power, and families fight to be heard in systems stacked against them. Those images stayed with her. They became fuel. If others could not speak, she would. If the system was built to shut doors, she would break them open. Law school was not a smooth climb. It was a battleground. She didn't walk into those lecture halls with legacy connections or family prestige. She walked in with determination, with nights spent studying when exhaustion screamed for rest, with the quiet fire of someone who knew she was carrying more than her own ambition. She was carrying the weight of every unheard voice she had grown up with. And when she passed the bar, it wasn't just a personal victory. It was proof that the walls could crack, that doors could open even when they were nailed shut. But Crockett didn't stop at law. She stepped into politics not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. She saw communities dismissed, leaders corrupted by self-interest, and she knew her voice could not remain at the edges. Each campaign was another uphill fight. Funding gaps, smear attempts, doubts whispered behind closed doors. And yet, Every challenge only sharpened her resolve. She won not by playing their game, but by redefining it. That courtroom moment with Howell wasn't new terrain. Crockett had been here before. Different faces, different tactics, same core message. Sit down. Be quiet. Know your place. She had heard it all her life, sometimes spoken, sometimes implied. But every time she had chosen defiance. Not the reckless kind, but the righteous kind. The defiance rooted in dignity, in the belief that no system, no robe, no gavel could erase truth. Her composure in front of Howell wasn't learned overnight. It came from years of pushing back against the weight of expectation, years of standing firm when silence would have been safer. And now, seated before a judge who thought a sanction could shatter her, Crockett carried with her the power of every battle she had already won. She wasn't just one woman in a courtroom. She was the embodiment of struggle turned into strength, of silence turned into voice, of dismissal turned into defiance. And as Howell prepared to tighten her grip, she had no idea that Crockett's story had made her unbreakable. The tension in the courtroom thickened as Judge Howell leaned forward, her tone cutting like a blade. Order must be maintained. This behavior cannot be tolerated. Each word was delivered with the precision of a threat, designed to chip away at Jasmine Crockett's resolve. The gallery shifted uneasily, eyes darting between the bench and the Congresswoman, who now carried the weight of expectation on her shoulders. Crockett did not blink. She sat upright, her silence a deliberate challenge, her composure sharper than any rebuttal. Howell, irritated by the lack of fear, pressed harder. She spoke of professional responsibility, of respect for the court, lacing every phrase with insinuation. To an untrained ear, it might have sounded procedural, but to anyone paying attention, it was theater, an attempt to box Crockett in, to force her into submission. The escalation was not just in Howell's words, but in the rhythm of the room itself. Gasps accompanied every pronouncement. Reporters scribbled as though history was being inked in real time. Each moment stretched, the stakes climbing higher. Crockett's allies in the back clenched their fists, whispering among themselves, willing her not to fold. And then Crockett spoke, calm, measured, not a trace of panic. Respect, she said softly, is a two-way street. The words were simple, but they landed like a blow. The gallery stirred, whispers swelling to murmurs. Howell stiffened, visibly rattled by the audacity of Crockett's restraint. It was no shouting match. Crockett didn't need to raise her voice. Instead, she let clarity and confidence do the work, exposing Howell's bluster for what it was, a desperate attempt to intimidate. Every response was surgical, every phrase chosen to slice away at the judge's facade of control. And with each exchange, the balance of power began to tilt. By now, it was no longer a question of whether Crockett could survive Howell's sanctioned threat. The question was how much further she would push, how deep her counterstrike would cut. The room, once firmly under Howell's command, now leaned toward Crockett, as though waiting for the moment she would deliver the line that no one could ignore. And that moment was closer than anyone imagined. Crockett waited, letting the silence stretch until it became unbearable. Howell's gavel hovered, her patience thinning, but the Congresswoman's stillness commanded the room. And then, with a voice steady as stone, Crockett began. "You say this is about respect," she said, her tone calm but cutting. "But respect cannot be demanded with a gavel. It must be earned by truth." The words sliced through the tension like glass shattering on marble. The gallery erupted with murmurs, a wave of disbelief rolling across the room. Howell's face tightened, but Crockett pressed on. Point by point, she dismantled the judge's argument. Every claim Howell made about decorum was turned back on her as hypocrisy. Every accusation of impropriety was reframed as an abuse of authority. Crockett's voice rose, not in volume, but in weight, building with the rhythm of a case being tried not just in a courtroom, but before the court of public opinion. "How many times," Crockett asked, her gaze locked on Howell, "have those in power tried to silence voices like mine, not because we are wrong, but because we refuse to bow?" The words hung heavy, impossible to ignore. A hush fell. Even reporters paused their pens, stunned by the precision of her strike. Howell attempted to interrupt, but Crockett didn't yield. Her timing was flawless, her delivery unstoppable. "If a sanction is your weapon," she declared, "then let the record show this. I will not be silenced by arrogance disguised as justice." The room shifted. It was no longer Howell's courtroom. It was Crockett's stage. With each phrase, she stripped the judge of authority, revealing not strength but desperation. Howell's smirk faltered, her composure cracking under the weight of truth. And then came the mic drop moment. Crockett leaned forward, her voice dropping to a near whisper, yet carrying with unshakable force. "You may control this bench, Judge, but you do not control me, and you will never control the truth." The silence that followed was deafening. The gallery, the press, even Howell herself sat frozen, stunned by the reversal. What was meant to be Crockett's humiliation had transformed into Howell's unraveling. And as the echoes of her words lingered, one thought burned in every mind present. This was no longer just a hearing. This was history. The moment Crockett's words hit the air, the courtroom ceased to feel like a sealed chamber. It felt like a broadcast, a ripple pushing outward. Reporters rushed to file their updates, fingers flying across keyboards. Headlines formed instantly. Crockett defies sanction threat. Judge Howell stunned in courtroom clash. Cameras clicked with frenzy, capturing the frozen expression on Howell's face, the steady fire in Crockett's eyes. Within minutes, the outside world caught fire. On social media, hashtag began to surge. Hashtag stand with Crockett. Hashtag truth over power. Hashtag unshaken. Memes sprouted from the still frames. Crockett leaning forward with conviction, Howell recoiling in silence. Supporters amplified her words across timelines. "You may control this bench, Judge, but you do not control me." It became a rallying cry, retweeted, reposted, repeated until it was impossible to escape. Commentators flooded networks. Some called it a career-defining moment. Others a masterclass in composure under fire. Pundits debated Howell's misstep, questioning whether a sanction threat had backfired so completely that her own authority now seemed diminished. But the strongest response came from ordinary people. Teachers, students, immigrants, workers, voices that rarely reached the courtroom, found themselves reflected in Crockett's defiance. They weren't just watching a legal skirmish. They were watching a battle for dignity, a reminder that authority without integrity is nothing more than noise. And in that recognition, a new wave of energy rose. Because what happened in that room was not staying contained. It was spreading, igniting, reshaping the conversation far beyond Howell's control. The only question now was, how would Crockett harness the moment to deliver the lesson that the nation so desperately needed to hear? When the noise faded, what remained was not just a clash between a judge and a congresswoman. It was a lesson carved into memory. Jasmine Crockett did more than defend herself. She reframed the moment into something bigger. She reminded everyone watching that dignity cannot be sanctioned and truth cannot be silenced. Authority without justice is fragile, but courage rooted in conviction endures. Her calm defiance turned intimidation into inspiration, transforming a threat into a beacon for anyone who had ever been told to stay quiet, to know their place, to shrink in the shadow of power. In Crockett's words, people saw themselves, the worker dismissed by a boss, the immigrant doubted by a system, the student told their voice didn't matter. Her triumph wasn't personal, it was collective. It proved that arrogance cracks when faced with resilience, and that even in the most intimidating of rooms, one steady voice can shift the ground beneath those who believe themselves untouchable. And as she left that courtroom, the lesson echoed far beyond its walls. Justice isn't the sound of the gavel. It's the strength of those who refuse to bow. Judge Howell tried to wield the gavel as a weapon, but Jasmine Crockett turned that moment into something unforgettable. What was meant to be her humiliation became her victory, a living reminder that dignity can't be sanctioned and truth can't be silenced. The arrogance of power cracked under the weight of calm defiance, and the nation saw it happen in real time. This wasn't just Crockett's fight. It was ours. Every word she spoke echoed for anyone who has ever been told to sit down, to stay quiet, to accept less than they deserve. Her stand proved that no matter how heavy the hand of authority seems, it can never crush the strength of conviction. And that's why we tell these stories, because they matter. They remind us that courage is contagious, that one voice can inspire thousands, and that justice belongs to those who refuse to bow. If you believe in standing tall against intimidation, if you believe in amplifying the voices that refuse to be silenced, then you're in the right place. This is Argument Arena, where truth confronts power and where your voice is part of the fight. Subscribe, share, be part of this movement.